doubt anyone actually wears this around their neck. It's a bit big. Thank you very much for that, John, and I thank the association for the medal. It's good to be here, and I look forward to talking to you for a few minutes today about fiscal situation in Canada, a little bit about the U.S., Europe, and elsewhere. I'll try not to go on too long. I'm mindful of the dangers of a politician going on too long. My heritage is Irish, which is obvious from my name. And I met with one of the trade minister last week in Toronto, and he told me this story about the Irish politician who got up and was giving a speech in a room like this, and he was going on and on and on, and some people got fed up with it, some went out that door, some over there, till finally there was just one fellow sitting in front of him. And the politician stopped. He said, "I want to thank you, sir, for your decency, for your courtesy in hearing me out." The fellow stood up and he said, "Don't thank me, I'm the next speaker." So I'll be mindful. If I see you leaving, I'll notice that I'm going on a bit too long. It's good to be back in New York. I'm here fairly often. The city is an inspiration for me, as it is for millions of my fellow Canadians and people around the world. Particularly lately, of course, the vitality and resilience in the face of adversity are a beacon for all people who value progress and prosperity in an uncertain world. Simply walking the streets in New York the last couple of days reminds me of what we can accomplish. It also inspires all of us to what we will accomplish. Yes, it's been a storm of some size, of course, that buffeted New York. Many people in those circumstances would still be assessing the damage and lamenting their plight and trying to figure out what to do next. Here, New Yorkers got back on their feet quickly and down to business with the kind of energy for which you are renowned. And you haven't been rebuilding alone. I'm happy to say Canadians have helped. Canadian Red Cross volunteers, tree crews, of course, line crews. Others have been here working alongside you and helping in whatever capacity they can. This, of course, is always reciprocal. I remember well when I was in the cabinet in the province of Ontario in the late 1990s. Some of you may not recall this, because I don't think it was as big as a weather event as in New York, upstate New York, upstate Vermont, as it was in eastern Ontario and in Quebec, which was an ice storm. It was an amazing storm that isolated people, particularly people in the rural part of eastern Ontario. People couldn't get food, they couldn't leave their homes. All the transmission lines were down, they were across the road. Telephone poles, hydro poles were across. This went on for weeks without power, and of course this was in the midst of an eastern Canadian winter. And it was at that time that many of the crews from not only New York State, but also Vermont, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts came to our assistance back then, which I remember well. So as with past challenges, I have every confidence that you'll overcome this challenge in a way that continues to inspire, and I offer, of course, our support as Canadians for moving on over this weather event. Let me turn to what we see as the major challenges facing economies today. In addition to offering their support, now more than ever, people will be turning to the people of this great nation for leadership. As we can see from the headlines every day, there are perils sweeping the economic world and lurking on the horizon. These perils are a constant reminder that our work responding to an unprecedented global economic crisis is not over. Americans have already shown in addressing the economic shocks of 2008-2009 that they don't back down from a challenge. And they certainly haven't here. After all, the American economy is growing once again. People are going back to work. The housing market that caused so much hardship in recent years is showing promising signs of stabilization and recovery. Still, the way forward for global economy we are all connected to remains uncertain. This is a challenge for all of us, of course, with respect to the fiscal crisis. It's very important for Canada. And I've certainly conveyed this concern to my colleagues in the U.S. administration, because Were there to be a decline, a significant decline in U.S. GDP next year, there would also be a very significant decline in Canadian GDP. And it would happen almost immediately. Our economies are so interrelated. 75% of our trade is with the United States. So this is of serious concern to us, particularly at a time where we still have, yes, our unemployment rate is lower than the U.S. rate, but we still have a lot of people unemployed. And we have an economy that's growing at 1.9 or 2% of real GDP. So the economic recovery is modest, to say the least, and we certainly want to keep it going in 2013. So as I say, this issue in Washington is one that we're concerned with, and of course a lot of our colleagues in the G7 and G20 are very concerned with, particularly when one looks at Europe and the situation in Europe, the challenges they have now. So let me say a few words about Europe. The recent data, which we've seen this week with respect to the European GDP, confirms that Europe has entered a recession. The European Commission recently concluded that the euro area will contract in 2012, GDP falling 0.4%, and suggested that unemployment won't start falling until 2014 in Europe, and then only slightly. And as you know, in many of the European countries, particularly in Southern Europe, unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, is double-digit and very significant. To complement matters, the latitude for an effective European response is more limited than it was during 2008, 2009. That said, I am encouraged. I think there are some encouraging signs in Europe. I'm encouraged by the ECB, the European Central Bank, announcement that it will support the proper functioning of sovereign bond markets in that area where warranted. I'm encouraged by the progress made in moving forward on the single supervisory mechanism for banks. I was quite encouraged after the IMF World Bank meetings in Tokyo that the Eurozone leaders met and gave a deadline, actually, for setting up the legislative framework for their supervisory body at the end of this year, and then instructed their finance ministers to, as they usually do, tell us, go do that, right? And so I hope they accomplish that by the end of the year, but it's not an easy task. What I liked about that in particular was that there was a deadline, and that has not been the common situation over the course of the past 4 years that we've been dealing with weakness in the Eurozone. So these are all steps in the right directions. Intentions must now become actions, as we stressed earlier this month at the G20 meeting of finance ministers, central bank governors in Mexico City. European leaders must make further progress on fiscal and banking unions. They must also urge vulnerable countries to reform and support these countries in their efforts. Europe can proceed knowing their efforts will be supported by significant international cooperation. In Mexico City, the G20 ministers of finance, central bank governors, committed to doing everything necessary to strengthen the overall health and growth of the global economy. We agreed jointly that the G20's focus in the time ahead will be to rebuild confidence, to reduce risks and volatility in international financial markets, and contribute to a faster pace of economic recovery and job creation, and promote the foundations for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. The context for this is as you know, these summit meetings in the G20 started in November 2008 after the crisis in October 2008, and President Bush brought together the leaders of the G20 in Washington, which was the first meeting in November 2008 with the finance ministers. And then there have been a series of meetings after that. There were 2 a year for a while. We had a meeting in Toronto, a G20 summit meeting, and at that meeting, there were commitments made by the G20 leaders to reduce their deficits by 2013 and then by 2016. What we didn't have is an accountability mechanism within the G20, and Canada and India were asked to chair the task force on strong, sustainable economic growth, which we did, and we reported back to the ministers more recently, and they supported the accountability framework. Now, we have to make sure we follow through on that and implement that and make sure that the accountability measures result in some reporting to the other G20 countries about progress toward those G20 Toronto summit goals. So this progress will be supported by our commitment to open trade and investment, expanding markets, and resisting protectionism in all its forms. Now, it was a very nice event in October. It was the 25th anniversary of the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement. It reminds us that the United States and Canada have been at the forefront of trade liberalization. To this day, our countries are one of the greatest examples of the mutual benefits of free trade. Since the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement came into force in 1989, two-way trade in goods and services with the United States has more than tripled. We have by far the largest bilateral trading relationship in the world. Even as other global markets grow, the one we've built together remains strong. And I don't need to go through all those numbers because my friend, the Consul General, did that. All those things that we do together and all the big numbers that happen. It's important with respect to employment, though. There are over 4,500 Canadian-owned businesses located in the United States in 17,000 locations, employing more than 500,000 Americans. And similarly, there's strong U.S. business investment in Canada. As you know, we welcome foreign direct investment in Canada, although it's a topical issue, and someone might want to ask me about that. But we do value foreign direct investment. Canada's wealth as a country, since the country was created in 1867, comes from the fact that we have been a free trading, open society. We are a relatively small country, not geographically, of course, but in population we are, about 34 million people. And our wealth, our standard of living, the hopes for the future rest on free trade. And it has been mentioned we are a government that has been and is firmly committed to free trade. In December of last year, Canada and the United States took the biggest step forward in bilateral cooperation since the signing of NAFTA with the launch of the Action Plan on Perimeter Security and Economic Competitiveness and the Action Plan on Regulatory Cooperation. Together, these agreements will create a new, modern border for a new century. They will enhance our mutual security and accelerate the legitimate flow of people, goods, and services between our two countries. In doing so, they will support economic competitiveness, job creation, and prosperity for both of our countries. The international solutions need not be limited solely to international cooperation, as fundamental as this is. Sometimes, the hard-won lessons of others can offer us perspectives that may be applicable to our own challenges. So allow me to say a few words about the Canadian experience, which more recently has been positive, but was certainly not positive 20 years ago, back in the 1990s. At that point, Canada had a fiscal crisis. We had the IMF in Ottawa. We had a very high debt-to-GDP ratio, and that was, I say, about 20 years ago. Standard & Poor's and Moody's downgraded our sovereign debt. The debt-to-GDP ratio was about 72% at that point. The Wall Street Journal characterized Canada as, quote, an honorary member of the third world, unquote. The Canadian dollar was referred to as the Canadian peso back then. Thankfully, today we're in better shape. Canada finds itself in a much more stable and responsible position thanks to the resilience that allowed us to move forward, and thanks to the support of the Canadian people. It's difficult to do these things when your country develops major, in our case, our country developed major deficits and debt accumulation, public debt accumulation in the 1970s and 1980s. And we did this with governments of different political stripes, liberal and conservative, big spending governments, deficits creating governments. So when we got to the mid-90s, it was something had to be done, and the government of the day did, and this has continued to the present day, so almost 20 years now. It required reductions in social spending and government expenditures, some of which were fairly severe back in the 1990s and the early part of this century. It moved us toward balanced budgets. It put our government in the position where we could pay down public debt before the recession of 08-09. And it put us in a position when the recession happened in the last quarter of 08 and then the beginning of 09, we were able to do a very substantial stimulus budget because we had enough room to move, and we still do have room to move if we need to, if that were to eventuate once again. It did create a big deficit, but as I say, there's popular support for the view in Canada today that governments should not run deficits, that governments should not increase public debt and burden the next generation. So we had public support to spend the money when we did, to try to make sure that we did not have double-digit unemployment, which we did not, and try to make sure that there was not a deeper, darker recession. And we came out of recession after 3 quarters and had the best recovery in the G20. Our job recovery is the best in the G7. Our job recovery is the best in the G7 as well. So this gives us the flexibility. A big change, if you go back and look at Canadian fiscal history from where we were back in the middle of the 1990s. So now, we ran a big deficit. I've reduced it in half since 2009. We're going to balance the budget within the next 2 to 3 years, barring some catastrophic events external to Canada, which could cause more difficulty. But if we stay on course, as we are now, we'll be able to balance the budget once again in the medium term. Some people say nice things about Canada. The IMF and the OECD say nice things. The World Economic Forum likes our banking systems. This is the world's soundest. We have the highest credit rating, AAA rating, which I understand we're going to keep for a while because we keep moving toward balanced budgets. Christine Lagarde says nice things at the IMF. She says that the measures taken to protect Canada's economy should be a model for countries trying to fix their financial systems. She said about Canada, abroad, Canada is identified by its values of coordination and consensus building, which has given your country influence beyond its years. So we had some determination, we had some tough choices, but they did provide us, as I mentioned a moment ago, with a valuable asset, and that is room to maneuver when crisis hit. And the benefits continue today. Since we introduced extraordinary budget stimulus in January 2009 in response to the recession, Canada has more than recovered both all of the economic output and all of the jobs lost during the recession. Going forward, real economic growth in Canada is expected to continue to be positive, as I said, although modest, and we remain on track to return to balanced budgets, as I said, in the medium term. This performance has been supported in no small part by our strong commitment to control growth in program spending by the government. This week, as we usually do about halfway through the fiscal year, I did an update of the fiscal situation for the Canadian people. It showed that the government program spending is on a fiscally responsible, sustainable track, well below the growth rate of government revenues over this and the next 5 years. We are committed to controlling government program spending by eliminating waste and inefficiencies. We also have made a deliberate choice to protect what we consider to be essential government spending. And by that I mean this. We spend in the federal government of Canada about a third of our revenues are transferred to the provinces. Those revenues are very important to the provinces. I can say that, having been a provincial minister, particularly for the big responsibilities of the provinces, which are healthcare, education, and social services. And we've committed not to reduce those transfers. In fact, we have a percentage increase built into those transfers going forward. The second third, and I'm being very approximate here, of our budget spending is on what are sometimes called, I suppose, entitlement programs, but they are for seniors, for persons with disabilities, for children. And we've made the commitment also we're not going to reduce that spending. So we're left with about a third of our spending, which is the actual program spending of government. And that is where we're finding and have found the savings we need to make sure that we can control our spending, that which we can control directly, so that we'll get back to balanced budgets in the medium term and be able to renew our paying down of public debt. We have supported job creation and growth with investments in knowledge and infrastructure and broad-based tax reductions. We are trying to be surgical in the spending that we do to make sure we're supporting innovation, R&D, supporting our universities, supporting research, and so on. We have kept taxes on a steady downward track, delivering tax relief to job-creating businesses over 2008, 2009, and the following 5 fiscal years. As John Paulson mentioned, when we took office in 2006, the federal corporate tax rate was just over 22% in Canada. We incrementally reduced it year after year after year until we got it down to 15%, which was the goal. At the same time, I went to the provinces who also have a corporate taxing power in Canada and encouraged them to get their corporate tax rate down to 10%. Most of them were somewhere in the teens at that point. A majority of them have accomplished that. Ontario, the largest province, is almost there. They're at 11.5% right now. The goal is to brand Canada in terms of business taxes as a low-tax jurisdiction at a combined federal-provincial rate of 25%. As I say, we're almost there. And we're not going to raise taxes going forward. If we need to find savings, we'll find them in that government expense envelope that I mentioned to you. So my most recent budget advanced the jobs and growth agenda by announcing measures to improve conditions for business investment, to promote innovation through support for research and development, and facilitate greater participation in the labor force by underrepresented groups. And this is an important challenge for us in terms of having enough people to do the work and the jobs that are going to be available in Canada going forward, including in the resource sector, not only in Western Canada, but also in Newfoundland and Labrador, which has significant offshore oil resources, not to mention the hydroelectric projects in Newfoundland, in Quebec, and elsewhere in Canada. So we're looking at some of the underrepresented groups, including seniors. Many seniors want to work, and so we're trying to facilitate that through our tax system. And then we have lots of persons with disabilities who want to engage in gainful employment in our society, and we have a special task force looking at that right now. Our Aboriginal population has about a 50% youth unemployment rate, and this is a terrible waste of human talent, so we're trying to improve that through specific training for Aboriginal people so that they can fit into the economy and gainfully be employed. So these are some of the things we're doing going forward to make sure we have enough people. We take a lot of immigrants in Canada. Per capita, we take more immigrants than any of the other modern Western industrial societies, but it still will not be enough. We will not have enough people unless we get more of the population engaged in the workforce going forward. Some of the most significant investments our government is making are those which will leverage the responsible development of Canada's tremendous energy and resources wealth, which includes the third largest oil reserves after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. It is estimated that in the next 25 years, the oil sands alone will support, on average, 480,000 jobs per year and add $2.3 trillion to our GDP. In broader terms, our resource sector also represents about 15% of our economy. It employs about 750,000 Canadians. This sector is not only an important job creator in Canada, it also offers significant opportunities for investment and supports the economic development of many communities across Canada. So we are taking important steps to reduce the regulatory burden associated with the review of major economic projects in order to stimulate additional investments by the private sector while continuing to protect the environment. What we're trying to get around here are multiple environmental assessments, multiple reviews of potential projects that go on for a long time, and sometimes so long that the original proponents of the investment are no longer interested in the investment. So our motto is one project, one review, with a definite time limit. And we're moving forward on that as we speak. So with these sorts of investments in the key drivers of economic growth and job creation and our return to balanced budgets over the medium term, I think we are striking the right balance. And the balance always is, and I have critics on the left and on the right, but the balance always is to preserve a degree of economic growth at the same time that one practices fiscal responsibility, and to make sure that we are not so restrained in our spending that we reduce economic growth to the point where we have higher unemployment. And that is true also, as you know, in some of the European countries where they have this struggle to do austerity at the same time that they struggle with high unemployment. And I think it's quite clear that they need help with that balance from some of the wealthier countries in Europe. So, I've gone on almost as long as it seems, and thank you for staying, most of you. It goes without saying that the ideal balance will vary from country to country and depend on each nation's unique circumstances. What is universal today, though, is the need to act decisively. The interconnected nature of our economies and the gravity of inaction are clear. This is something that should be nonpartisan and cross party lines. It is my hope that with the recent election behind you, the leaders of this great democracy can now turn their attention to working together in common purpose to confront and overcome national challenges which have global consequences. You have proven time and time again that you are capable of doing so. So as a number of tax increases and spending reduction measures representing about 4% of U.S. GDP are scheduled to come into force automatically within weeks, time is of the essence. The U.S. needs a credible medium-term plan to reduce its fiscal deficit over time, and it needs political agreement in the short term so that markets and investors can be confident that its economic recovery will continue uninterrupted. So it's my hope that Canada's experiences facing similar challenges as I have outlined them today can offer some guidance and inspiration on the importance of finding a way forward. In your efforts, I can assure you that your nation can continue to count on Canada as an ally, a business partner, and a friend that never hesitates to lend a hand when times get tough, as you do for us. That's what good neighbors, after all, do best. Thank you for the invitation and the medal. Thanks very much. That later.